Hi there, and welcome to the American Marketing Association Marketing Power podcast series. I'm your host, David Kennard, and today's youth culture is fundamentally different than it was maybe 5, even 10 years ago. And perhaps that's largely driven by technology, but certainly driven by mobile devices. And while many businesses and advertisers think they know what youth want, how they interact, and how they use technology, and that might be gauged by what we see in movies or on television, I think we may have gotten it all wrong. So joining me today to help us find out how the mobile youth are interacting in today's culture, how they're engaging with content and with each other, is Graham Brown. He's the author of The Mobile Youth, Voices of the Mobile Generation, and he's also founder and partner of Mobile Youth. They're a research advisory firm that helps companies understand and connect with youth to better develop customer insights, innovation, marketing. They're also the publishers of the annual Mobile Youth Report and other briefings covering mobile youth culture, youth marketing, and the social customer. Graham, welcome to the program. I read a lot of business books, and frankly, yours is quite different. It's reading more like an ethnographic study than the traditional business book. Can you tell me why you wrote this book and what you were trying to accomplish through it?
Okay. Well, thanks for having me on, David. So, about the book, well, I wanted to really, in essence, tell young people's story. And the way that the book writes the story is actually as a narrative. So, it, as you say, it's a little bit different to business books because it's not written out in a sort of a more dry, factual basis. It's actually trying to recall the story from their lives. Because I spent 10 years traveling the world talking to brands and young people, and I realized there was a disconnect. And I also realized there was an amazing amount of innovation out there in the youth market. So I began collecting these stories on my travels. And in a way, it could read like a travel log, like a travel book. And in some ways, it is business because it is trying to get the message across through maybe a different medium. So essentially what it is about is young people's story told through their eyes.
And we've got 10 stories, and they cover all different parts of the globe. Is there a certain broad brushstroke as we read those stories that we might be able to take out, some themes or some threads that might define today's youth culture, specifically about technology or the mobile devices, or in other areas of how they see the world and engage with each other?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Each of the stories is really, each dealing with a different thread, a different element of youth mobile culture. And what we find, David, is that the differences between adults and young people are greater than the differences between young people and young people in different countries. So a young girl, one of the stories of Danielle in Long Island, her life, and say, for example, one of the Japanese high school girl story that we mentioned in Chapter 3, those lives are more similar than maybe between Danielle and her parents. So, as they have more access to technology, the internet, they can see the available options for their lives out there and the cultures that they want to be part of and the subcultures they want to subscribe to. We find that there's more and more similarities between young people around the world. And I know a lot of people like to talk about we're different here. This is not how things are done in our country. But I think if you travel and you see these stories, you find that there are more similarities than differences. And that makes it very interesting because the themes that you find in these countries are themes that happen everywhere in youth culture. So,
what would be some of those themes? What are some of the things that you're seeing that are shared by youth across the world then?
Well, I'll start with the theme in the U.S., which is the Danielle story. And this is really interesting, David, because basically this really is about how adults don't get young people when it comes to technology. And it's sort of a story told through parents and their children. And Danielle is at high school. It's a real story, but obviously we changed the names to protect the innocent in this, in her identity and so on. The key is here that she communicates with her boyfriend, and she does this through video chat. And what's interesting about this is that she's doing video chat about 4 or 5 hours a day, and her parents don't even know. about this. So she's doing it in her back room, and she's doing it very subtly that they don't know. But the way they use video chat is really interesting, and this is where the difference happens. We as adults tend to think that if we use video chat, it's very active, very purposeful. It's like, I'm doing this, or look at me here. Whereas the way that teens and young adults maybe are using it, they're using it more as, how can I describe, like a CCTV in their own bedroom. Mm-hmm. So they set up the video, and Danielle will be doing her homework where her boyfriend will be playing on the PlayStation 3, but they'll be having a video link. So she can watch him, he can watch her, and they're not necessarily chatting most of the time. So the theme here is about active and passive, is that as adults we tend to think people use technology in an active way, but the way that young people do use it tends to be this very passive communication. And if you look at young people's communication, it's primarily passive. And that's really where the new trends come from, the new directions in technology.
Well, I will admit that I found myself identifying with Danielle's parents in this story as we read it, and thinking about my own teenage kids and how they would be using chat for 4 or 5 hours. And I'm thinking, what do you talk about? And she would say, we're not talking. We're just being. Now, is that a common misperception of all youth, or is that just certain types of youth? And what I'm trying to find out here, and you said it a moment ago, that adults and teens or youth are probably more different than youth and youth from across cultures. Is this a uniquely American thing or Western culture thing, this passive nature, or are you finding it across all global boundaries?
It's very common globally, and it tends to be something that happens in many different formats. To answer the first part of that question about, the misperception, mm-hmm. It's common. If you're an adult and you walk into your kid's bedroom and you just see, the kids and their friends just hanging out or in the back room, you kind of find yourself thinking, what are you guys doing? Why don't you do something useful? But for them, it is useful. It's this passive hanging out communication, and it's meaningful because just belonging, as you say, being, is a key driver for their behavior, right? It's if you took it into the animal kingdom, it's the gorillas or the monkeys sitting around grooming each other, right? It has no real overt logical reasoning for us to understand it as adults, but for young people, it's very meaningful. And you find this all over the world. You find it in different formats, and some of the stories touch on this in how it happens in different cultures. I mean, the similarities with Japan are very strong with how high school girls would use technology in a similar kind of way. So they wouldn't be communicating sort of what we would see as adults logically. They would just be sending each other meaningless messages or, updating their statuses or these kind of things that we think are behaviors that are very specific to our local markets. But you find this kind of behavior all over the world. And the reason is because that need to belong for young people is so strong that we kind of forget what it was like when we were teenagers, how important that was, how important it was, in some cases more important than food, sustenance, whatever. So it is a very universal driver. It's very misunderstood by adults.
You mentioned in your book, and I may be taking this out of context, but you mentioned in there that things which may be too analog have become uninteresting. And I'm wondering if the behavior of the mobile youth bleeds into other areas, redefining not just youth and technology, but in a larger, even local or global community, if that analog nature of our interactions, or if in the elements of our lives is not interesting enough to capture people's attention, what does that mean for other parts of how we engage and interact as a society or as a culture?
Well, I think this can be easily misread, this point. And the key here is that the analog aspects of our lives, especially for young people, are extremely important, even to young people in their eyes. But what we as marketers or technologists tend to do is see them as uninteresting because, you can't really emphasize the cool, exciting aspects of a new technology when you start talking analog. you have to talk about the faster, better, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at the data and you look at the studies that underpin this point, is that young people, the most important for them is offline contact. And they will say that too. So when they use technology, when they use Facebook or they use mobile phones or whatever messaging platforms it may be, they're doing it because they want to get offline contact at some point. So it's the means is the technology, the end is offline contact, that analog contact. And they actually found studies, cited in the book, of when they put a young girl with her mother, they found that when they measured the stress levels measured by oxytocin in the brain, they actually fell during physical contact as opposed to when they were talking via instant messaging or BlackBerry messaging. So whilst text messaging and technology may seem important for them, what they're really doing it towards is getting that end goal of getting contact in the offline world. So I think we as technologists tend to think we can create this meaning in the online world, and we forget about, well, why are they doing this? How is this going to help me meet up with my friends? How is this going to help me look good at school or, at college and so on? That's what we tend to forget about, and that's the uninteresting part for us as adults, because we tend to think that that's not important when actually that's the most important thing for them.
Yeah, I was really surprised to read that, face-to-face is still very important for this youth culture. And what you just said, that they're using technology as a means to get to that face-to-face end. How is but when they get together in that face-to-face end, is it still pretty passive then, and they're still using technology within that element when they're together, or do they drop off the technology use once they finally have achieved their real-time face-to-face interactions?
Well, we've all sort of seen the scenes of young people hanging out, and they may be hanging out together, but all on their mobile phones, right, talking to other people. So I think the technology is always there, but it's that physical contact which is extremely important, and it's just being in the same room most of the time. So technology never takes a back seat. It's always there, but we kind of have to remember why it's being used. They're not getting together to use technology. They're using technology to get together.
Well, and I think you could tell the story of when you and your mates got together at one point when you were young and you were chatting and used the idea of people were smoking their cigarettes and placed their pack of cigarettes out on the table. And then years later you got together with the same group of people and the cigarettes were gone and were replaced by their mobile phones. Right. It's that ever present, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very interesting because they all perform similar kind of roles in our social interaction. So there's the display, there's the belonging, there's all the rituals that go with these social tools. And it's very interesting when I actually started looking at the data and saying, well, is there any sort of correlation between these social tools? So take cigarette usage and mobile phone usage by teens specifically. And how do they overlay? Because I looked at the data and I found that smoking in the U.S. amongst teens has been pretty consistent since way back in, records began in the 60s. And it peaked in about 1998 and then started falling off. And so I started thinking, well, what caused that? Have young people suddenly become more health conscious? Probably not. Have they suddenly started listening to their parents? Probably not. So there must have been something else. And when you overlay the data, you find that teen mobile usage starts to appear in 1997, 1998. So it may be a coincidence, but as mobile usage began to grow and young people started to get cell phones in the US, smoking began to drop off. And, there's been 30, 40 years of public health campaigns about teen smoking, and they've had limited impact long term. But what really has had a major impact is cell phone ownership. And the reason is because they perform a similar kind of role in their social day-to-day lives. And I think it's a very interesting untold story which may merit more, insight and more, to see actually how one's replaced the other, because that has implications for public policy makers.
So I want to switch gears here a little bit because as I was reading the stories in here and some of the statistics of how many youth are using mobile and using it, and you mentioned just a moment ago the innovation within the youth market of how they use their mobile devices, it struck me. In business, we refer to the adoption cycle of new products and services by identifying the early adopters, the early majority, late majority, and laggards. Are there the same cycles within youth? Are there early adopters within youth, or does the youth market represent the early adopter market for all of us when it comes to mobile technology and how we might be using it in the future?
I think if you want to use that adoption curve to understand how sort of technology spreads from a small group to the mass market, and then look at the youth market, there are similar patterns.
Okay.
And there are, a group of mass market, the laggards, who are slow to pick up on technology. But generally, if you compare youth to adults, you'd find that it tends to happen before. So, the classic example is text messaging. And what you found there was, text messaging, SMS, was included in the GSM standard originally for cell phones for engineers. So an engineer would send out a network test message, and it would say something like test, delete, or ignore this message. Because nobody thought that 160 characters would be enough for communication, right? And that's how we adults thought about it. We thought, well, they've got email, they've got IM at the time, so, why bother? But it took young people, particularly the early adopters, to look at this and say, well, I'm paying 50 cents or $1 a minute for my phone calls. What about this text message? So send a text message, do it for free as it was at the beginning until the mobile carriers caught up with it and started charging. But by that time, it had spread to, a bigger market in the youth segment. And then you had teens teaching their moms and dads how to text. So you had that sort of progression from the youth market to the older market and through older siblings and so on. So there are similar adoption curves, but what tends to be the case is that what young people are doing today, adults will be doing tomorrow. And we see this in many technologies, like in Facebook or BlackBerry Messenger and so on.
Yeah, I think adults get in there and ruin it for the kids, and they move on to someplace else. That's right. So let's make some application to business. We've got a lot of marketers who listen to the program and business leaders and people who want to take this information and now do something with it. If I wanted to connect with the youth market, whether I am a technology company or I'm a cause-related organization or I'm just trying to sell yogurt on the corner store, how can I use what we're finding in the mobile youth to help me connect with these youth in their mobile way and still engage with them and do all the things that you've mentioned in the book? How do I translate this into activity into my daily business life?
Okay, well, I think, David, the most important thing is to understand that this generation has different expectations. They're not different species in any way, but they have different expectations about media, about organizations, about NGOs, about publications, about brands, and so on. And the expectations are, as sort of illustrated in the story of the book about the young boy in the Rio slum who goes out and covers, the biggest news story of the year with a cell phone when all the journalists are outside the slum, unable to get in and cover the story. The expectations are different because they understand that they can do it. They've got the tools to go out there and tell their story. And if you're an NGO or you're a brand or you're a technologist, the most important question that young people ask about what you do is, where am I in this story? Our generation, David, when we grew up, we saw Pepsi, MTV, Madonna on the big screen. And, that was us branding, and we bought into that. And it was all about the Pepsi story. But now, for this generation, they're not interested in the brand story. They're interested in telling their story. What brands and technologists and marketers and so on need to be doing is helping young people tell their story. Because if you don't, they'll find somebody who will. And they've got the tools to do this now. So it's really about whose story are you telling? Are you using mobile phones to tell the brand story to young people? Well, that's just what we were doing back in 1989. Or are you using the brand to help young people tell their story through mobile phones and through technology and so on? Because they can still love the brand, they can still love the organization, because you're helping them get out there to their friends and to their peers and so on.
So take this generation and fast forward them 15 to 20 years. Do they become more traditional, like we as their parents are now more traditional? Or do they continue this innovative and evolutionary change, forcing a change for everybody? How does business, when these young people become adults, how does business respond to them?
I mean, that's a great question, because, the question is about whether or not it's very specific to this generation, or, and how will they grow up with these drivers, or whether or not it's a big difference between young people as they become an adult. Do they become like adults as they are now? Well, I think, if we look at young people now, they have little to lose and a lot to gain for experimenting and trying out new technologies and so on. As you get older, regardless of what generation they came from, you start to be less bothered about trying to find new things and really, you'd rather pay for something in it, out of the box. Mm-hmm. So no doubt this generation, when they grow up, will become less innovative, because that's natural, because they will get their mortgages, they will get their careers and so on, and they'll be less mobile geographically. But there will be a few things which won't change, and that is, as I said, their expectations. What we see now with young people will be default in 10, 15 years amongst the mass market, in how they use media, how they interact with government and NGOs and so on. So some things will change, and some things will remain consistent. And I think we have to understand which is which. The fact that, yes, they will become less aggressive in their use of technology and less innovative, but at the same time, some things will be set early in stone about their relationships with other organizations.
Mm-hmm. This is something I wish we could continue talking about, but we're out of time. Graham, where can people find the Mobile Youth? Where can they find you? How can they continue to learn about this and engage with the content that you've just published?
Okay, the easiest way is to go to Google and type in Mobile Youth Book, and you'll find all the links there. You can get it from Amazon, or there's some links on our site which will take you to PDF downloads and so on.
I've been talking with Graham Brown. He is a founder and partner of Mobile Youth, a research advisory firm, and he's just finished writing and publishing The Mobile Youth, Voices of the Mobile Generation. There's 10 stories in there that are compelling and written from the perspective of the youth, not us stodgy old parents. I highly recommend you go to the website, Mobile Youth, and find it on the web as well as buy the book. Graham, thanks for joining us, and thank you, everyone, for listening to the American Marketing Association Marketing Power podcast series. Don't forget to subscribe to the RSS feed on marketingpower.com, and that's how you're going to get the updates about podcast interviews and AMA TV and all the great information that the association has to offer you. All this is available at marketingpower.com. Until next time, I've been your host, David Kennard.